Hey guys, Kruger here. Today we are talking about the Mage class in Lord of the Rings Conquest. The Mage class is a true powerhouse in its own right, but it's also an excellent support class, so let's get into it. Looking at the loadout for mages in the character select screen, we see its listed weapons are Staff and Lightning, and its special abilities are Heal, Shockwave, and Firewall. The Lightning attack is the bread and butter of the Mage class. It's a ranged attack that does solid damage, so it's absolutely worth spamming. It can be charged up for a second or two to create a chain lightning attack that lets you target more than one enemy. If you partially charge it, you only deal damage to two enemies, while if you fully charge it, you'll do damage to three enemies. My observation from my own gameplay is that it's rarely worth it to charge it up all the way, and it's usually better just to spam it. It appears to me that you're actually sacrificing a small amount of overall damage when you charge it up, just because of the amount of time it takes. The only time in which I bother to fully charge up my lightning attack as a mage is if I have a group of enemies coming at me from a distance and, there's no other enemies nearby, so I have free time to, set up the fully charged lightning attack. In that case, why not? I actually found a little bit of a hack or an exploit or whatever, which is that I found that if I jumped in between uses of lightning, I slightly increased my overall rate of fire. There's kind of like a pause animation between lightning attacks, and when you jump, it appears that you bypass that. I wasn't able to fully empirically prove that or anything, but through my observation, it definitely seemed to be the case that it was a way for me to increase my, rate of fire a bit just by constantly jumping between lightning attacks. So moving on to the staff, what we have there is a much more mixed bag. It's a melee attack that has a three-part combo, with the last attack being a staff slam that does a small amount of radial damage and can knock enemies back and off of their feet. Staff attacks do much less damage than lightning attacks, though, and they trap you in melee, which is a very dangerous place for a mage to be in. Because mages can't block in melee and don't have much health, if a warrior or scout starts attacking you, you're often at a point where you're essentially trapped and just kind of doomed to die. Because of that, mages need to be very wary about melee combat, and the staff should not be seen as an alternative, weapon playstyle, but more like a specific tool for specific circumstances. If you're playing in campaign mode and are up against waves of grunts, the staff with its mediocre radial damage can be a decent option, though it requires you to be up close and taking hits, and it still isn't much better than just, staying behind your allies and blasting enemies with lightning. That probably is the better option, even if it's more boring. It's safe, it's reliable, and, in the campaign, at least you have infinite allies, so that's not a big deal if they're taking the hits for you. If they die, they can just keep coming, so it's pretty safe to just kind of stay behind them and, let them take the hits while you stay at range. So the use cases for the staff, then, are kind of specific. So the staff can be useful since it can knock down dangerous enemies, which, can give you space to kind of retreat a bit, keep your distance, blast them with lightning. And the staff can also be used to knock enemies off of a ledge, though it doesn't send enemies that far back, so, it's not as useful as the, archer's kick attack, which has an insane range, but it can still be useful that way. And the mage's staff attack can actually be useful for occupying certain enemies like mages, because if a mage is getting hit with a staff and the whole three-part combo, they can't really do anything for a moment. So and mages are dangerous enemies for you, so that can be useful to kind of occupy them. And plus, if they're at kind of low health already, or if you have a firewall on their feet which is doing continual damage to them, occupying them with the staff attack can be a useful way to kind of take them out of the picture, until they die. So it's kind of niche, but there's a few more effects or specific uses. If you're knocked down to the ground, you can perform a rise attack with your staff while getting back up, and that can be a way to knock an enemy or two off of their feet, and let you get up, get out of a dangerous situation, and get some space. That's not always the absolute easiest to aim. And, of course, if they're blocking, it doesn't do anything. But, it's useful. It can be useful. And that's an important thing to note about the staff, is that the staff can be blocked. whereas the lightning attack can only be blocked by other mages, shield effect. So that's definitely something that holds the staff back, because it does, the damage it does is already quite poor. And even when it's being used to do radial damage, it's really not doing much radial damage at all. And it can be blocked. So altogether, it's not a great option. You can also jump up and then, do a staff attack to slam it on the ground, which can be useful, do a bit more damage, do some radial damage, knock an enemy down as long as they're not blocking. But I very often found it to just be kind of ineffective. If I would do it against a warrior and they would just block and it wouldn't really do anything. But, if you're like in the campaign mode and you're up against grunts, it's an option, even if it's not truly that amazing. So yeah, the staff is definitely situational and overall underpowered, especially just compared to the regular lightning attack, which, keeping in the distance, jumping in between, blasts and just, making ranged attacks, I think that's almost always just the best option. But, sometimes if there's like a big scrum, you might have allies in the way and, you're trying to hit the enemy, but they're just kind of getting in the way of your lightning. So that can be a situation where, running in and slamming your staff down can be a way to get in a bit of damage, even though there's allies in the way. And I suppose you could try to combo a lightning attack, jumping up to kind of, expedite your next lightning attack, but then actually doing a staff slam in between lightning attacks. Theoretically it's something you can do, but I don't think I was ever really in a circumstance where it made sense to do that, or at least was like necessary. So I guess that's a theoretical combo, but it's mainly just hypothetical. So before we move on to the special abilities of the class, let's talk about the Mage's Shield. So it's a large bubble of magic that can conjure around themselves. They can hold it indefinitely, and any projectile that tries to get through that shield is deflected. And the shield wall actually, or the firewall, that mage's special ability, it bounces off, but actually like hits the ground and still does its effect. And the same is true for like the archers, like fire and poison abilities. So sometimes just, if you're playing against mages, sometimes it can still be valuable to shoot at their shield, ability, because it will bounce off and hit nearby enemies. But so the shield doesn't necessarily completely nullify projectiles, but it largely does. And like I said, it deflects any projectile, even like catapult projectiles, which is kind of crazy. So as a general class feature, it's very strong. When you're playing as another class, it's not infrequent that you'll find yourself kind of huddling near another mage to kind of hide under their shield for some protection, or, waiting for them to heal you. But when you're actually playing the class yourself, it's usually just not really worth the opportunity cost. I mean, you can't really do anything else if you're holding up, a shield. So unless you're like in a situation where just standing there is still productive because you're trying to capture like a command post, or you're like trying to reach an area and there's like archers or something similar in the distance who are attacking you. In those instances, it can be very useful to have the shield ability up. And actually in the campaign, there's a few specific levels where it's just super nice. I think one of them, specifically Osgiliath in the Evil campaign, you're just getting completely like pelted with archers that that most classes can't actually reach or do anything with. So it's really nice to just be able to ignore them while you're going down that large strip and just, have your shield up. You can actually use the shield kind of in a reactive sense also. So if a warrior is not that far away from you and they're throwing their axe at you, you can put up a shield to block it and then, just immediately put it down. You can also do that if a mage is trying to hit you with a firewall. I want to call it a fireball because it's like the animation of a fireball, but technically it's called firewall. But so if a mage is trying to hit you with a firewall or a lightning attack, popping up your shield real quick can be very useful. There's a few cases in which you basically have like a wizard duel in the campaign, like against Saruman or against the Mouth of Sauron. So in those cases, if you're in a mage versus mage situation, it's very useful to be able to pop up your shield real quick to deflect, firewalls and lightning attacks. Archers, I feel like their attacks aren't really telegraphed in the same way, so it's harder to really react to. I found that in most cases, just kind of, strafing or moving side to side while you move around lets you usually, dodge archer projectiles, at least AI archer projectiles. And the archer projectiles that you really want to avoid, like the fire arrow or the poison arrow, I feel like those just aren't really telegraphed in the same way that, say, a warrior's axe throw is. So maybe if you're a really observant player, you could reactively use shield to avoid that. But I don't know. I never did myself because it's just not telegraphed enough, really. And usually you can just dodge archer attacks. There's also the satchel bomb throw from the scout, but I didn't find them using that too often against me, at least when I was playing as a mage. I found that most often they just, went invisible and tried to, sneak up behind me to backstab me or run up to me and, unleash a combo. So really, I found, the whole, using the shield reactively, I found that to mainly be relevant for warriors and mages. And maybe I just wasn't like a observant, fast enough thinking player, but I just I rarely did that. There were plenty of opportunities for me to do that against warriors. I guess I wasn't on the ball enough, but, usually strafing generally let me avoid getting hit by those axes anyway, so it wasn't super necessary. But it's still certainly a very useful ability to have, and it's probably more useful in like a multiplayer game where you're up against, intelligent humans who are much better at using those abilities. But so it's a useful thing, but the shield ability, I didn't find myself using it a huge amount as a mage, I'll just say. There's certainly situations where it's useful, but I've generally found it better to just let the AI mages pop up the shields, and I just focused on other things. So the first special ability we're going to talk about is Heal. Heal is super straightforward. You just heal yourself and a number of allies nearby, and it heals you for a good amount, and it's very useful. You have very low health, so it's very valuable to have that as a way to keep yourself topped off and just, out of the danger zone. And some enemies like warriors and scouts, could take you down to 0 health or near 0 health very quickly. So it's always worth being overcautious and, healing yourself even if you don't take that much damage. Healing allies is certainly useful, but I definitely think it's a much lower priority than healing yourself. If it was like multiplayer or something like that, I think it'd be more useful. But in the campaign, much of what you'd be healing in terms of allies are just grunts, and it's basically pointless to heal them anyway. So, if you're trying to take a command post and you have some allies near you, I think keeping them topped off with health can actually be very helpful. I mean, it's one of those things where you don't really notice the effect. I'm pretty sure I'm pretty sure it's pretty useful to keep your allies topped off for when there's large scrums of enemies, or if you have a few, allies near you and you're trying to take a command post. But it's definitely something you wouldn't really actively notice the impact. But yeah, heal is a very useful ability. But like I said, I think it's best to keep yourself, topped off, no matter what. So the next ability is Shockwave, which is where you slam your staff down and produce a large shockwave and a radial effect around you. It does a lot of damage. It can be very useful against multiple opponents. It's still useful against a single opponent. It knocks them off their feet. It knocks them back a bit. I believe you can use it to knock an enemy off a ledge, though I don't know if I ever really did. Really, it's like the kind of the free, special ability staff moves you have that are like that. It's kind of like that, but just on steroids, way more powerful. But of course, it has a cooldown effect, so. But yeah, it's just a very useful ability. You can knock down a dangerous enemy to give you more space. You can, it's just a all-around very useful, option. Single target damage, multi-enemy target damage, 10 temporarily getting enemies out of the picture, just, making it so they can't do anything for a bit. It's all around super useful, and there's really not much else to say about it, I don't think. So the final special ability is Firewall, which I really want to call Fireball since you are shooting out a fireball. But yeah, so this is super powerful ability. Maybe the most powerful special ability in the game. It's excellent. So you launch out a fireball out at a target, and it has a powerful impact, and then it creates a radial burning effect, by where it hits. And the initial attack does good damage, but the radial, burning effect does very good damage as well. So, the initial attack hits an enemy, it's doing good damage, and, the longer they're staying in that impact, the more damage it's doing, and just, very much depletes health bars. You can be very strategic with it. You can put it at an area and then try to kind of trap an enemy in it so it keeps doing damage, like with staff attacks. And you can also put it on like a doorway or somewhere where a large group of enemies are or where they're about to pass through. And of course, on campaign mode, it's always fun to drop a firewall on a spot that grunts are about to pass through and just watch them like melt. It's a lot of fun, and it's very powerful. Like Shockwave, Firewall is very good against single targets. It's excellent against groups of enemies. And yeah, I really do think it's probably the most powerful special ability in the game. It's kind of defining for the Mage class. It's a true hammer. So yeah, that's kind of the overall picture of the Mage class. Like I said, it's very powerful. I think I read a review of the game that said that it was the most powerful class, like to an unfair degree. I don't know if that's necessarily true. I think the Archer is very powerful. At the very least, the Archer is super powerful for the actual campaign. And I think the Archer was a bit more powerful in terms of, easily completing the campaign than the Mage is. But in terms of like multiplayer, I just don't really have much data, or I don't have much anecdotal data for that to really say, which one is more powerful. And there's also instant action, but that's not very significant. That's pretty easy. But yeah, so the Mage, it's just really a super well-rounded class. It's powerful at doing so many things. It's great at support. It's really the only support class in the game, and I actually come to think of it, but it's very solid support with the shielding and the healing, and it can do a ton of damage to single targets, and it's also really good against groups. So its downsides are that its range is kind of poor, so it can't stay comfortably far away from dangerous enemies like archers can, and like I said, it's vulnerable in melee against warriors and scouts. And it can't stay super far away from them the same way archers can. But yeah, really, that's a powerful class, and kind of my own personal experience is that I didn't find myself super enjoying this class, honestly. It feels like it doesn't have that many, I guess, options, and it feels like only a few of its options are really worth using. So I don't know, I just felt like it wasn't the most fun in terms of classes. So very powerful class, but, just in my opinion, not a super fun class. But that's pretty subjective. So, yeah, thank you for watching. Let me know what you think, and have a good one. Goodbye.